the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
You are Locked On Giants, your daily New York Giants podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, New York Giant fans, and welcome to another edition of Locked On Giants, part of the Locked On Podcast family, your team every day. I am Patricia Traina. Happy to have you with us again here on another edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. And boy, we've got a lot to go through, not just today, but the rest of the week, because the New York Giants had a trade, first of all, that we'll talk about coming up. And more importantly, they had a massive media session. John Mara spoke, Dave Gettleman spoke, the coordinator spoke, the head coach spoke, the assistant coaches spoke. So much came out of Tuesday's media session. Oh yeah, and there was a practice too. So there is a lot of ground to cover. We're going to cover some of it today, and then we're going to continue to cover all of this as we go through the week here on the Locked On Giants podcast. Just an amazing and busy day for the media. All right, so we're going to talk about the Giants trade. We're going to talk about the burning question of, is Giants general manager Dave Gettleman on the hot seat? And we're going to just have some takeaways from the pressers from John Mara and Dave Gettleman. And then, like I said, later on in the week, we'll touch upon some of the other pressers and things that were said. There's just a lot of stuff to cover. So happy to have you with us. Let's kick it off with the New York Giants trade. Now, this trade, to be honest with you, I can't honestly say that I'm surprised the Giants made this move, because for those who haven't heard, the Giants traded cornerback Isaac Yiadom to the Green Bay Packers for cornerback Josh Jackson. Say that 10 times fast, right? So a lot of people I know reached out to me and they said, why did the Giants trade one cornerback for another? And I'm going to try to answer that for you in just a moment. But first, I want to talk about the trade itself. Now, remember, last year, the Giants acquired Isaac Yiadom in a trade from Denver. It was a conditional 7th round pick was the terms. And of course, Isaac Yiadom came over, and the hope was he would be able to play man coverage. I think that was his scouting report coming out of college, that he was better in man press coverage than he was in zone. And that unfortunately didn't turn out to be the case. So Isaac Yiadom lost his starting job a couple times last year for Ryan Lewis, who then ended up getting injured. And then Isaac Yiadom was back in the lineup. And, you know, not a horrible year by Isaac Yiadom, but if the Giants are looking to play man press coverage, as they probably are this year, Isaac Yiadom's not the guy to do it. That's why the Giants went out and they got Adoree Jackson. And that's why they tried to upgrade the defensive backfield talent. So here's the thing. So the Giants sent a 7th round draft pick from this year's class to Denver for Isaac Yiadom. And now the Giants, in turn, because they've got a crowded cornerbacks room, flipped that pick, or that trade, I should say, Isaac Yiadom to the Packers for their former 2nd round pick. I think he was drafted in 2018, Jackson was. So in a way, the Giants kind of upgraded with just doing a player for player swap. All right. So what are the Giants getting in Josh Jackson? So I reached out to a colleague of mine over in Green Bay who actually gave me a heads up on the trade that it was coming down the pipe. And Jackson has kind of been a little bit of a disappointment in Green Bay. He had a strong rookie season, a guy who, you know, was very productive in college, came out, had a good rookie season, and then who kind of not only fell off in his production, but who just hasn't been able to hold on to a starting role, let alone a backup role. And I think, matter of fact, I remember seeing something about him having fallen behind on the depth chart, going from the 2s to the 3rd string. So in researching Jackson, he can play man coverage. That's the scouting report on him. Now, how well can he play it? That I don't know. He's not a ball hawk. He's not a turnover machine. It's not going to come up with a lot of, interceptions. I think he has something like, I want to say maybe 3 in his career. Doesn't break up a lot of passes, but he can play man coverage. So maybe you're looking at a potential dime package type of role for him. Or if he ends up not making the roster, which is certainly a possibility, maybe he goes and he goes to the practice squad, because it's not like the Giants gave up a draft pick for him. So it's really nothing ventured, nothing gained. They were going to cut Isaac Yiadom anyway, I think. I don't think Isaac Yiadom was going to make the roster. So it's really not a high-risk move for the Giants to bring in Josh Jackson, see if a change of scenery can help him maybe rejuvenate his career a little bit. So we'll see how he, takes to the Giants defense over the next few days. I'm sure he'll see time in the game against Cleveland this weekend. He should be with the team, I would say, probably by the time they get to Cleveland for the joint practices on Thursday. So very interested to see how that plays out. I think it's going to be quite an interesting scenario, especially with the Giants. They're a little short staff. Aaron Robinson right now, just in listening to head coach Joe Judge, I am willing to bet that Aaron Robinson starts the regular season on the PUP list. He's recovering from that core muscle injury, and I believe he had surgery for it. I'm not counting on him. I think what they're going to do with him is going to be similar to what they did with Xavier McKinney last year. And McKinney ended up breaking his foot late in training camp, and he went on IR. And then once he was healthy, they brought him back and they let him get his feet wet. So it's just some interesting developments there into the Giants defensive backfield. And remember, they also traded for Keon Croson, who is more or less a special teamer. And I'm starting to think that, Nate Ebner, all this talk about Nate Ebner coming back, I don't see that happening now. I just get the impression, how many guys can you carry that are exclusively special teamers? Now you've got to devote a safety potentially to Nate Ebner. I don't think that's going to be the case, at least not in the beginning. Maybe later on in the year, if they have injuries, you might see that, but not right off the bat. So that's kind of where the Giants are at with the trade. And I mentioned Croson real quick. Special teams dynamo. That is an acquisition I really like. And I like the fact that the Giants, by the way, didn't touch any of their 2022 draft choices to acquire him. They sent, I think it was a 6th rounder in 2023 to the Houston Texans to get Croson. And I like that move, because next year the Giants are going to need all the draft picks they can possibly have, because they're not going to be able to do a whole lot in free agency given their salary cap situation. So smart move there by Dave Gettleman. They'll pay off that depth in a couple of years and see how it works out. And if Croson, who, by the way, I think is in the final year of his rookie contract, if he develops into, the type of player that Joe Judge, who had him in New England, by the way, I think in 2018, if he can pick up where he left off and be, that special teams dynamo that he was for New England and also for the Houston Texans. Don't go away just yet, Giant fans. Plenty more coming up on today's Locked On Giants episode. But first, get all the latest news, odds, info, and sign-up bonuses for all your sporting needs by heading over to BetOnline on your laptop or mobile device. When you open an account and use our special promo code LOCKEDON, you will receive a 50% welcome bonus on your first deposit. Again, that's code LOCKEDON for your 50% welcome bonus. Terms and conditions apply. BetOnline, your online sportsbook experts. All right, Giant fans, let's talk about Dave Gettleman, general manager. Both he and John Mara spoke to the media today, as I mentioned at the top of the program. And the big question that, or one of many questions that people wanted to know, is Dave Gettleman on the hot seat? And that was put to John Mara. And John Mara kind of joked and said, hey, look, we're all on the hot seat. We're all in this together. Everybody's on the hot seat. But really, when you look at things and how they've kind of unfolded, at the end of the day, it's on the general manager. He's the one who is bringing in the guys, who's, overseeing the contract negotiations, who's building the roster. Yes, the head coach has something to do with it. Joe Judge is very active actively involved in that. So to say that Joe Judge doesn't have anything to do with it, that's not an accurate statement. But Dave Gettleman is the head honcho when it comes to that. So the question is Dave Gettleman on the hot seat if the Giants don't make the playoffs? And the answer is kind of a yes, no type of deal. It's yes in one regard and no in another. So let's look at the yes part of it, why he would be on the hot seat. Gettleman, as we all know, spent a lot of money on free agents. He brought in a lot of veteran guys to help this roster. Almost reminds me of what they did in 2016 when they tried to, quote unquote, buy a bunch of talent to boost up the roster and make a run for the playoffs, which, by the way, worked in 2016. Now, unfortunately for the Giants, in 2017 and 2018 and 19, it all fell apart. And it was a lesson back then. And quite honestly, one that I didn't think the Giants would repeat. I was kind of surprised that they repeated it this year. But basically, the way you build up the team is through the draft. You don't necessarily rely heavily on free agency. The Giants this time around, though, with Dave Gettleman in 2021, a little too heavy of a reliance, I think, on free agency, but an equally heavy reliance on the draft. So it's not like, okay, free agency is trying to be a mulligan for whiffs on the Giants draft class. That's not the case here. That said, if all this talent assembled underachieves and the Giants don't get more wins, as John Mara said was what he wants to see, I could potentially see them tearing it all down and starting over from scratch. And that includes Dave Gettleman. So in that regard, yes, his seat is heating up. All right. If the Giants underachieve, they stay healthy, but they only win 5 games, for example, or they match and win 6 games. That's not going to be good. John Mara is not going to be happy. Now, here's the other thing. Why Gettleman's seat isn't warm. If the Giants go through the year and let's say the injury bug wipes out, the main players or a particular unit or something like that, then I don't see how you can blame that on Dave Gettleman. People today were asking about Saquon Barkley and if Gettleman had any regrets over drafting Saquon Barkley. And he said, no, why would I have regrets? Just because the guy got injured. I mean, who could see injuries coming? You can't plan for that. I mean, you plan in one way in that you want to have depth that can step in if you have injuries, but it's not like you sit there at the start of the season and you say, oh my God, we better plan for James Bradbury getting injured or Blake Martinez getting injured. You can't predict that. You can't predict injuries. So the Giants, they have depth at all the positions. Well, most of the positions. There's still a couple that are still lacking in depth. Offensive line and tight end come to mind. But if injuries or circumstances beyond the Giants' control lead to them having another 6-win season, then John Mara rightfully said that, it's all going to depend. He's, at the end of the year, he's going to look at the circumstances behind what the record is and make a decision there. And I think if the Giants get banged up and depleted of talent, depending on the severity of that, Dave's going to be safe. So yes, in some ways, Dave Gettleman is on the hot seat because this roster better produce. And as John said, he wants to walk off the field at the end of the day and know that this team is headed in the right direction, which they were at the end of last year, by the way, which is why Dave Gettleman was retained. But if that's not the case, if all this money was spent and they don't have anything to show for it, despite being healthy, then I fear we will be looking at a complete teardown. And I don't know about you, but the Giants have now had 2 different teardowns. They had one after that 2017 season when they brought in Pat Shermer. Then they had one after Shermer couldn't get done with Joe Judge. That's a lot of tear downs in a short period of time. And at some point, you just have to let it take root and grow. You can't keep starting from scratch with a new coaching staff or a new quarterback or a new left tackle or a new this or new that. And that's where the Giants are kind of at, I think, right now with Dave Gettleman, with their roster. They need to see progress. Now, one other thing I want to mention that John Mara said in his presser, he was asked about playoffs and if it's a playoffs or bust mandate. And he says it's not. That said, the team won 6 games last year. He wants to see more wins this year. I don't know what it's going to take to win the NFC East, but you would think that if they win enough games, if they win a few more than what they have won in the past, then the playoffs would be in reach. So at some point, yes, you can look for progress and you could say, okay, yeah, the team's headed in the right direction. But at some point, that team's got to start looking at making a run for the playoffs. And last year, the Giants in a very weak NFC East, they were able to, hold their own. They were competitive right down to the end, which was progress that, John Mara recognized. Will they be able to do that again this year? Well, there's a lot of optimism. John spoke about liking the process and how Joe Judge handles the team, how the team responds to Joe Judge. He believes he finally got it right with the head coaching selection. I happen to agree with that, by the way. Judge has his finger on the pulse of this team, knows what he wants and how to get there. And he's done a good job in guiding those guys to the ultimate goal. So a lot of optimism coming from the Giants today, from their leadership, from John Mara, who feels like the team is going in the right direction. Now, I know we've heard this before from John. I think he said it the last 2 or 3 years, and we all know how that worked out. But this year, I hope for his sake, I hope for all of our sakes, that his good gut feeling that he has comes to fruition. Giant fans, we have plenty more coming up on this edition of the LockedOn Giants podcast. But first, Built Bar is a healthy, low-carb, low-sugar, and high-protein treat that will satisfy your sweet tooth. Choose from 9 amazing flavors plus the occasional limited-time offering available in nut and nut-free varieties. Visit BuiltBar.com and get 15% off your first order with the promo code LOCKED15, that's LOCKED15 at BuiltBar.com for 15% off your first order. All right, let's talk a little bit now about what Dave had to say. Now, it's interesting. He's changed over the years. A couple examples I'll give you is one philosophy he has is with contracts. Now, in the past, Dave would never really do contracts mid-year. He has decided to change that philosophy. So if a guy has a good year and they have an opportunity to re-sign that guy and extend him, Dave will do that. Whether or not he'll do it this year, I don't know. Their cap situation next year is really, really tight. I don't know how they're going to find the money, but we will see. That's still to be determined. And Giants will be able to get some money back once they make roster cuts. I'm sure the cap is going to change a little bit, the cap space. I think they had a little over $2 million last I checked, according to the NFLPA public cap report. But they're going to get more money back once roster cuts are made and they get down to the 53-man roster. The top 51 will go away, and some of these contracts that currently aren't being counted now are going to start to be counted. All right. The other way Dave has changed is he seems a lot more mellow. He's not as high strung, and by that I mean he's not as quick to panic. And I'm talking in terms of the offensive line specifically. Dave was asked about the offensive line, which the starting unit looked pretty good. The backup unit, not so good. And plus, they had some injuries too. So I asked Dave actually about how do you balance trusting the process that Joe Judge has in place versus deciding when to make a move. And I'm going to play you the audio clip from Dave, his response to my question.
It's a process that you keep working through, Patty. At some point, at a certain point in time, when you got to pull the trigger. Okay, and I think that since I've been here, you guys have seen I'm not afraid to pull the trigger. So there's a balance. It's a legitimate question because it's kind of like, but we'll know, and I think that we need to have another preseason game. The last year we didn't have this. We didn't have this. We didn't have preseason games, and it's difficult. It made it difficult. We weren't any different than anybody else. I'm not suggesting for a moment we were, but at the end of the day, Patty, you're right. We've got to understand when it's time to pull the trigger, and right now I'm really excited about us going to Cleveland, and I guess some of you folks are going to be out there getting a chance to work against them, and then playing on Sunday, and that I think will give us a real good indicator of where we're at.
Okay, so basically what it sounds like is Dave and the Giants are going to try to get through this week at Cleveland, see how things come together, and if there is still some shakiness there, they're going to make a move. So now they might make a move as far as adding offensive line depth before they leave for Cleveland. And by the way, they leave for Cleveland today, Wednesday. So I would not be surprised if they add an offensive lineman to their group before they leave for Cleveland, or maybe shortly after they arrive in Cleveland, because you do need, enough live bodies to kind of get through the practices. That said, we're not talking about major wholesale changes just yet. If the problems that we saw in the first preseason game continue, then I think we're going to see maybe some shakeups. The problem right now, to be honest with you, with the offensive line, there's not a lot of guys out there that are worth bringing in. The guys that are out there, some of the well-known names, I know DJ Fluker is available, but he just had, I believe, meniscus surgery. I know a lot of you have asked me about Austin Reiter, and that sounds like it's a money issue. It could also be a matter of, him wanting to be guaranteed a starting job. So there is not a lot of options right now. I think once we get to the maybe second round of cuts, which by the way happens after, I think it's next Tuesday, the second round of cuts happen. So they got to go from 80, I believe it's 85 to 80. And then of course the following week you go from 80 down to 53. So basically the talent pool has to kind of be replenished, because right now just not a whole lot out there. And I think that's why the Giants are maybe biding their time. They don't want to commit money to a guy, especially a veteran who might want a signing bonus or who might want some guaranteed money. The Giants really aren't in a position to do that right now. So I could see them maybe bringing in a younger guy who might not be as fussy about that, just wanting a chance. But I still say, and I said this kind of when I did my roster projection the other day, which by the way is probably now way outdated, which is why I don't like to do these things too soon. But anyway, I said the other day that the Giants, the offensive linemen, there's probably one or two guys still not on the roster. They're probably on somebody else's roster right now. All right, Giant fans, that is going to do it for this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Make sure you keep it here the rest of the week. We'll have more from the big media day. We'll have reports from the Cleveland joint practices. Ed Valentine will be with me later in the week, and we'll do kind of a state of the Giants assessment. We actually taped it earlier this week, but going to hold that show until a little later this week because it's still going to hold true most of the content we discussed. So that's coming up. And I see some of you have sent in some questions after we ran Twitter Tuesday. So I'm going to try and fit those into different segments as we go through the week, because I don't want to hold those up for you guys. I know you guys are waiting for answers from me, so I will try to get those in as well. All right, Giant fans, that's going to do it for me on this edition of the Locked On Giants podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we will talk to you again tomorrow.